Montana plates, questionable insurance, no garage, but I got a Ferrari. I had a Ferrari 360 and I bought it. This was a huge deal. I bought it January of 2013, right as I quit my job to write about cars. I took out a massive bank loan. I was shooting my shot. I was going to buy a Ferrari 360 and make videos about it on YouTube and write about it for Jalopnik. It was a big deal because these days, like, everyone has a special car. On YouTube, it's not uncommon. People have Bugattis, for God's sake. Now there's like a bunch of content creators with crazy cars. I mean, Stradman has a Koenigsegg, Ed Bolian's got a Bugatti, but in 2013, that was not the case. And in fact, I was a big deal for being a guy who had a Ferrari 360 on the internet. Like, just having that was like made me a sensation at the time. I bought the car kind of knowing that a regular guy driving this special car would be an interesting video series. I bought it with this massive bank loan. I bought it from Florida. I have a rule against buying cars from Florida because, well, you know Freddie. But I have a rule against buying cars in Florida, but unbelievably, this one was tremendously well maintained. The guy had every service record in a laminated folder. He did not belong in Florida. He should have been somewhere else. He was like very fastidious and meticulous. It was a stick 360 at a time when stick cars had no value premium, which is almost hard to believe now. But truly, at that time, tip was a new tip, as I call it, but F1 was a new thing, basically, more or less. You know, in 99, it had just come out. They had kind of refined it through the 360, and it was like a hot thing. That's sort of what some people preferred it, and some people preferred the manual, and so it was no value premium. I knew I wanted a stick. I found a stick. I flew down to Florida to buy it. And at the time, what I would do was I had this thing called the Doug car, where I would announce to my audience I was buying a fun special car, and I would let them kind of vote on what it would be. And more or less what I used to do is I would get it down to like the top 5, and then I would pick the one I wanted the most of the top 5. Although some years I just picked the number 1. And that's how I ended up with a Hummer. I bought the 360 in Florida, and I drove it home. I could not afford this car. It is impossible for me to explain how much I cannot afford this car. Take the least supercar of 40 YouTuber that exists right now, Freddie with his P1, I was way worse. I could make the payments as long as money kept coming in, but the loan had required that I put down like half because I had no credit history. So I had used all my cash on the loan, and then I had to make these payments. So not only did I register that thing deep Montana, I mean, I was like as Montana as it got, but like I could barely afford insurance. And I'll never forget, what ended up happening was I was waiting for a ticket to drop off my insurance because the insurer that would do Montana wouldn't insure me while the ticket was still on. So I got like insurance from State Farm at an astronomical level, but I didn't tell them about Montana because I was sketchy. Once the ticket dropped off, I canceled the State Farm insurance, then insured with the people who would do Montana, and then I was like, okay. But I was still driving around with this like third-rate insurance broker with Montana plates. And I remember everywhere I'd go, I'd park the car and I would put a Georgia plate on because I didn't want people to see. That was so bad. I bought the car and I drove it home, and the audience really did respond very well. However, I was perpetually terrified. If something had broken, I couldn't afford it. Now, in retrospect, I know the 360 is actually a pretty reliable car. I don't know if you remember this, but you took me for a ride in a 360, or we test drove one or something before I bought mine, just to so I could see what it was like. It actually is a pretty reliable car. There wasn't gonna be any major thing that happened, especially because I bought a later one. The earlier cars had a few little issues, but I bought an 04, which was essentially the final year. It was the final year of the coupe. It was never gonna have problems. But the first night I brought it home, I will never forget this. Drove the car all the way from Orlando to Atlanta, which is a long drive. Parked it in my friend's garage. I didn't have a garage. Okay, this is how sketchy I was. Montana plates, questionable insurance, no garage, but I got a Ferrari. Parked at my friend's garage. The next morning I went to start it up. White smoke billows out the back of the car for like a while. I'm like, oh my God, like what is this? I don't know what this is. Oh my God. I freaked out. I was so scared. I had no money to fix whatever this was. I had made this big choice and spent all my money. And if it broke, I was done. I turned it off. I remember I called you. I was terrified. I called everybody I knew who knew anything about these cars. And later I started it again and there was no smoke. And later I started it other times and there was no smoke and it never came back. And it was interesting because I bought the car in December and it had always been in Florida. I wonder then and in retrospect if it was just its first time being cold in a long time, and it had its first cold start in literally years, and for some reason that had some effect. And then it was like, well, was it smoke or was it steam? And I couldn't replicate it because I didn't know, because it didn't happen again. And so like, I don't know what happened, and I still don't know what happened. But the car never gave me any problems. I owned it for a full year. I got super lucky. I never had a single problem with it. One time I rented it out to be in a movie. It was supposed to be in Ride Along 2. It was parked outside of a club at a club scene in Ride Along 2, but unfortunately, it was not actually shown. It was going to be in like the establishing shot where they like show the club, but they cut that shot. But they paid me $1,000 to use it for like 2 hours. But I drove that car then, and I had it on YouTube and on Jalopnik, and it really kind of blew up. That and the CarMax Range Rover at the same time was like my star rising. And there were a few viral videos that I did with that car, the most viral of which was I let all of my friends drive it. That was like a big deal. Like, finding enough people to drive stick, but I like then did a compilation of like all of their responses, like trying to figure out how to get the gated shifter into gear and all that. And that was funny. And in a time before those cars were very common, I mean, Instagram had just started to exist. You didn't see all that stuff around. Now those cars are kind of ubiquitous on Instagram and on YouTube and all social media, TikTok. But back then it was like, oh, this is a special thing. It became clear to me a month into the ownership that like men who buy these cars to attract women won't. And so I did a video that was somewhat staged of like driving it to places where there are women and seeing their responses. I mean, we drove it around Lenox Mall for like an hour filming women. I mean, it's the creepiest thing in the world. Not a single one of them looked, right? Like that. And that was the whole thing. It was like, that was the video. We were able to get like 12 minutes of content of women not caring about my Ferrari. And a couple of the people were like friends of mine who I staged, like we're filling up next to each other in gas, and they weren't looking at it. But that was my genuine experience with the car. I just didn't necessarily want to shoot that closely with like random women. And the very last scene, we put a golden retriever on the passenger seat, and then like we had a bunch of women like come up to the car, and that was the point. Like that's what really will attract women. You don't want a Ferrari's not going to do it. It was silly and stupid, but a lot of my videos were back then, and it did the job. I owned it for a year, and then I sold it to a guy in Northern California who still has it. It was a bit of a disappointment, actually. The 360 I never felt was a particularly great car. The front end was too light. The steering and handling wasn't particularly excellent. It did not have much power, but it did the job. It like got me on the map in terms of like, oh, a regular guy talking about his ownership experience with a special car. And every week I would make a new video like, here's why I don't drive it regularly. And you'd talk about potholes, and you'd show it going into a pothole. And one time I strapped a TV to the roof of it to show like, if you did daily drive it, what it would be like. And in my opinion, it was one of the early people who like had exotic cars on YouTube. Salamandrin was the other dude at that time. And we were kind of it. And then it exploded, and the whole category took off. And now nothing is like cool enough, like nothing in the world. But that was the 360.
This month of VINwiki content is brought to you by Auto Tempest. Auto Tempest has supported VINwiki for years, Car Trek as well, all of our friends, but what we really love them for is that it is the most powerful way to shop for your next car. They compile all the results from all the major listing sites into one place. Autotempest.com, all the cars, one search. That means you get to all the deep, dark corners of the internet to find the exact car that you're looking for as fast and efficiently and powerfully as possible. You also get to see how it stacks up against all the other cars like it that are for sale around the country. And so check them out now at the link in the description below to shop for your next car with Auto Tempest, and thank them for their ongoing support of VINwiki.